In December of 1995, after months of planning and research, I undertook one of my most exotic ship safaris. Along with my partner Mike, I spent a week in Japan chasing 3 classic passenger ships, then headed off to Hong Kong for part 2 of the adventure. This was our first ever visit to Hong Kong, which was still under British control.
They're building a giant suspension bridge down there. Oh, wow.
Our plane circled over the under-construction Cap Shui Mun cable stay and the Sing Ma suspension bridges, which would soon connect Hong Kong with Lantau Island, where the new airport was being built.
Wow. Wow. It's the Seabourn in Hong Kong.
Although I didn't know it at the time, we even passed over the sunken remains of the Seawise University, the ex-Queen Elizabeth, which burnt and capsized in Hong Kong in January of 1972. So not only were we experiencing Hong Kong prior to its return to Chinese rule, we would also get the added thrill of landing at the old Kai Tak Airport on Kowloon. And then while we were taxiing, I spotted a classic ship from the plane window, which was hopefully a good omen. From the airport, we headed off to our hotel in Kowloon, where we dropped off our luggage and then went directly to the Star Ferry, where we would cross to Hong Kong. I love that our first ferry, the Northern Star, shared the name of a favorite but short-lived British liner. Before we began the short crossing, we were joined by throngs of local commuters. Almost immediately off our starboard side, I spotted the SS Shanghai anchored in the outer harbor. I probably should have already mentioned, she was the reason we came to Hong Kong. Oh, and the Orient Princess, which I saw earlier from the plane, was on our port side. I'll be sharing a lot more about both ships soon, but that evening we were just 2 tourists enjoying our first visit to Hong Kong. Back in those pre-smartphone days, we followed a Lonely Planet guide's recommendation for a local restaurant, which aside from its bizarre honeycomb ceiling, was just mediocre. Honestly, we'd had much better Chinese food in San Francisco, and they didn't even have green tea ice cream, which is why I have that somewhat sour look on my face. And so we left it to the twinkling star to take us back to Kowloon, leaving the bright lights of Hong Kong in our wake. The next morning, we booked one of Star Ferry's harbor cruises, which not only gave us an overview of Victoria Harbor, but gave me a chance to document loads of fascinating ships. And almost immediately we spotted the incoming Delphin Star, which most recently sailed for Silversea as a Silver Explorer. And next up at the domestic passenger terminal was a former Dane, the sleek Nanhu, which was berthed behind another classic, the Xinghu. And something always seemed to get in the way whenever I pointed the camera at the magnificent Shanghai. The tour boat then wound its way through rafts of barges with tall platforms for loading cargo. Not since Piraeus had I seen such a variety and quantity of shipping. Well, maybe it was due to the air pollution, but Hong Kong's golden lighting made the rust-streaked ships, including this Chinese freighter, look all the more exotic and alluring. But no ship that day, or any other for that matter, could out-allure or out-exotic the Shanghai, which had finally come out of hiding. She was the last of a once ubiquitous breed of combination passenger cargo liners that were ultimately decimated by the jumbo jet and containerization. Our boat then circled back to Victoria Harbor. The Orient Princess, which was built in 1967 as the Yaohua for China to East Africa service, was showing off her ultra-sleek French-built lines. Orient Princess was anchored with the little Donghu, the former Spanish ferry Santa Maria de la Paz, which was also built in 1967. Both of these ships were operating on overnight gambling cruises, where they would sail out into the South China Sea and open up their myriad casinos and massage services, returning early the next morning in time for their clients to go back to work. For a short time, our tour boat positioned itself off of Kowloon's airport, where we watched the takeoffs and landings before resuming course abaft of the handsome Orient Princess. Bearing a strong resemblance to the 1966-built French cruise ship Renaissance, Orient Princess was China's first purpose-built passenger ship and flagship when she was Yaohua. In 2003, Orient Princess was sent to Tianjin, where she now serves as a floating hotel and restaurant. Also engaged in overnight gambling cruises at the time, the Delphin Star, which was berthed at Kowloon's International Cruise Terminal, was built in 1989 as the luxe expedition ship Delphin Clipper. She's had many names, but most notably in 2002 she became the world discoverer for Society Expeditions, and in 2007 she became the Prince Albert II for Silver Sea Cruises, who renamed her Silver Explorer in 2011. In 2022, Silver Explorer was sold to new owner Explorus, an expedition cruise line, and is scheduled to return to service in 2023. The Xinghu, which was somewhat of a legend in China after being featured on a popular Chinese television program, was built in 1967 as a Spanish cruise ship, Cabo Izada. In 1970, she was sold to West Tours and renamed West Star, where she became a pioneer in Alaskan cruising. In 1975, she became the Philippine cruise ship Doña Montserrat until 1979, when she was sold to the People's Republic of China as the Xinghu. At this time, she was operating between Hong Kong and Guangzhou. Xinghu was scrapped in 2001. Directly aft of Xinghu at the domestic passenger terminal, Nanhu was preparing to depart for a local Chinese port, most likely Sheko. This remarkably handsome ship was built in Denmark in 1961. Designed by the renowned architect Kai Korbing, she served as a ferry Kong Olav V until 1968. In many aspects, she was a precursor to the legendary DFDS ferries England and Winston Churchill. After several owners and name changes in Asian waters, she was sold to the People's Republic of China and renamed Nanhu in 1981. Nanhu was decommissioned shortly after this footage was taken and scrapped in China. We were soon back on the Star Ferry to Hong Kong Central, passing the distant Shanghai again to purchase our tickets for the Shanghai's next sailing to Shanghai. Her owners, China Merchant Shipping, had recently been operating a fascinating fleet of vintage comboliners in Chinese coastal service, but with new roads, airports, and trains being constructed, The ships were being phased out. A few weeks prior, I had sent a fax requesting 2 tickets on the Shanghai's December 23rd sailing. Their agent, Mr. Wong,
Hello, Mr. Wong.
sent a welcoming reply, but let us know we had to pay in cash at the office, which is what I'm doing here, along with showing him a copy of an old brochure showing the ship as P&O Line's Cafe. It was then that he informed me that this was Shanghai's last voyage. Once again, I made it just in the nick of time.
She used to be green. Now she's not green. She's white.
Yeah.
So
40 years.
40 years. Very, very special ship.
After securing passage in the ship's top suite, Mike and I once again resumed our tourist duties and hopped on a double-decker bus to the tram that would take us up to Victoria Peak. My obsession with chasing crumbling old ships has provided a lot of enriching and life-affirming experiences, and this was certainly one of them. In addition to being a top maritime hub, Hong Kong was and still is a fascinating and vibrant city, and even with the intervening smog, the view from Victoria Peak is spectacular. And getting there is truly half the fun. That evening in central Hong Kong, the only way to look was up as we made our way back to Kowloon. Even in Hong Kong, Christmas was in the air. As we walked from Kowloon's Tsim Sha Tsui terminal back to our hotel, we said goodnight to a few friends we first encountered that morning. On our third morning, as we clambered aboard the ferry to Lantau Island to see the Big Buddha and hopefully discover some interesting ships in Hong Kong's outer harbor, we got up close and personal with what was then one of the world's most luxurious cruise ships, Seabourn Cruises' Seabourn Pride, which was alongside Kowloon's overseas cruise terminal. We had actually spotted her a few days earlier in dry dock as our plane made its descent over Kowloon. Next up, we passed the incoming Jinhu. We'll talk more about her later. For your average cruise enthusiast, booking a sailing on the SS Shanghai would probably be the equivalent of flying Aeroflot. But for a die-hard classic ship lover, it was like stepping into a gilded time machine. As our ferry sped along, all I could do was marvel at this ship's remarkably sleek mid-20th century lines. I'll talk much more about her history in the next video, but in a nutshell, she was built in 1957 as the Belgian liner Baudouinville, but best known for her P&O Line service as the Cathay. In 1976, she was sold to the Chinese government and renamed Kengshan, then Shanghai, and then had spent the 80s and early 90s operating between Hong Kong and Shanghai. As we crossed Hong Kong's outer bay, the anchorages were filled with all sorts of dilapidated and fascinating-looking ships. And it got a lot more interesting when I spotted the Hang Li way out by the Cap Shui Mun Bridge, and, much closer, the burnout wreck of the Zenith. The Zenith was built in 1956 by Harland and Wolff. Yes, the same shipyard that built the Titanic. More on her in a bit after we round this island. Even our ferry boat was an interesting mix of seagoing jalopy and pagoda. She was certainly sputtering along at a relatively breakneck pace. We had a much better view of Zenith after passing the islet, one of 3 sisters built for the British Transport Commission and later Sea Link. She was originally the Duke of Argyll. More on her during the return journey. As we neared Lantau, we passed the handsomely archaic cruiser spoon stern of the freighter Sea Duke and some impressive ferries that were the size of small cruise ships. From where we docked, a coach would take us along a mountain road to our first stop, a local fishing village.
Second stop today, Taigo.
So if seafood's your thing, this was the ideal stop. And then we were off to see the Big Buddha, albeit with a pitch or two from our tour guide.
By the monks, and people use these as good luck charms to hang at doorways and at windows. And the red tassels are to drive away evil spirits, and the chimes of the bells are to deafen evil spirits. 向嗰個方向咧就向東北。咁咧其實咧就好多爭議性。
Tiantan, or Big Buddha, is 112 feet tall and made of bronze. It was only 2 years old at the time of our visit, and built to celebrate the relationship between man and nature. Almost as impressive as the Buddha itself are the 6 devas at its base with their various offerings. From its base, there was a sweeping view of the Po Lin Monastery, where we had a delicious vegetarian lunch, the best meal of the trip, then paid a visit to the main temple before returning to the ferry. On our return, the lighting on the woe-begotten Zenith was ideal. As the Duke of Argyll, she operated between Heysham in the UK to Belfast and on occasional cruises between 1956 and 1975. With the air pollution and numerous ships intervening, it was challenging to get a good shot of the Hang Li. If her profile looks familiar, she was the former Matson and Pacific Far East liner Mariposa, which was rebuilt from the C-3 freighter Pine Tree Mariner in 1956. This footage certainly wouldn't do, so I would spend the entire next day trying to capture her. We sped past yet more fabulously funky freighters, and then there she was, the anime Wong of passenger ships, the bewitching Shanghai, without the attending cargo barges, unencumbered at last. Knowing that she would never return to these waters, I coveted every second of footage that I could capture of this floating anachronism. Admittedly a little boxy looking, Jinhu was another Chinese liner with an impressive pedigree, but But first, let's have a closer look at the Seabourn Pride. Laid down as the Signet Pride for what was initially to be Signet Cruise Lines, her name and that of the deluxe company she was launching were changed to Seabourn when she was introduced in 1988. Christened by Shirley Temple Black, the 9,975 gross ton, 212 passenger ship boasted all outside suites, a marina platform, and even a Nautilus room for viewing undersea life. In 2005, she was given French balconies, and in 2013, she was sold to Windstar Cruises, becoming their Star Pride. In 2021, she was given a 25.6-meter midsection, new engines, and completely restyled cabins and public areas. We made it over to the domestic terminal just in time to watch the Jinhu depart. This ship was actually much older than her somewhat boxy appearance would indicate, dating from 1968 as the Swedish State Railways ferry Drottningen. After service in Mediterranean waters for subsequent owners, she was bought by the Chinese and renamed Jinhu in 1993. She is believed to have been scrapped in the early 2000s. Another classic, the Tianhu, was originally the ferry Visby and built in 1964. With their dummy funnels sporting an observation lounge and aft uptakes, she and her sisters were prototypes of the Sunward, the ship that started it all for NCL. She was scrapped in the early 2000s. And finally, a mysterious-looking incoming ferry appears to have been the little Zhejiang. Special thanks to Pam Massey for the tip. On our way back to the Simsha Tui terminal to catch the ferry over to Hong Kong for yet another tourist stop, we passed some now familiar ladies of the evening. We were actually on our way to Aberdeen, where a cluster of deliciously gaudy floating restaurants offered up bastions of Tivoli lights and neon, red and gold paint, and more dragons and chandeliers than you could possibly count. Las Vegas and the Joe Farkas-designed early carnival ships actually looked tame in comparison to this lavishly garish assembly of Chinese restaurants built atop a series of barges. No trip to Hong Kong would be complete without paying them a nighttime visit. I can't remember anything about the food itself, but I'm glad to have at least seen the jumbo with my own eyes. Sadly, it sank in 2022 while under tow to Cambodia. From the dazzling lights of Aberdeen to Kowloon's brilliantly lit international cruise terminal, it was yet another extraordinary night in Hong Kong. I would have just one more day that I would dedicate to the pursuit of a very special ship. The next morning, I was off on a high-speed ferry, passing the international cruise terminal where my old friend the Island Princess had joined the Seabourn Pride. Unfortunately, as we picked up speed, everything outside, including the Shanghai, had turned into a Salvador Dali painting. This particular ferry, the only one that would pass near the Hangleys anchorage, was fully enclosed and impossible to shoot from. If nothing else, I captured some arty views of the Singma and Kap Shui Mun bridges, but nothing of the Hang Li. My next attempt, the ferry to Discovery Bay, had a nice open deck where I was able to get some preliminary views of the Tonghu, a former Argentine coastal liner. Hopefully I'd get a chance to catch up with her later. If nothing else, this was a nice opportunity to add more footage of the Shanghai and other Hong Kong ships to my archive. And there she was at last. When my fascination with ocean liners first began in the mid-70s, I spent many a happy day of my teenhood visiting the Hang Li when she was Pacific Far East Line's Mariposa. Mariposa and her twin Monterey were frequent callers at Los Angeles and San Francisco until retired in 1978. And this would end up being the best view I would get of the ship I often watched sailing off with streamers billowing from her open promenades. And there again was the Zenith, the ex-Duke of Argyll, which caught fire and was beached 6 months prior. On our return, we made another pass by the 1964-built Tong Hu. So I decided to stay on the Discovery Bay ferry for another last round of footage of these fascinating ships, nearly all of which are gone now. As a child, I always thought that the Shanghai, which was then called Cathay, was yacht-like perfection. I never could have imagined I would get to sail in her, a dream that would be realized the following day. In 1983, Mariposa was sold to the Chinese, who re-engined her with diesels and began operating her between Hong Kong and Shanghai as the Jinjiang and later Queen of Jinjiang, and finally Hang Li. After the ferry turned around at Discovery Bay, I took my very last shot of Hang Li, which sailed off to Alang for scrapping just a couple months later. And the Zenith would soon be refloated and towed off for scrap as well. As we neared Kowloon, we encountered the outbound Xinghu. When she operated as the West Star, one of her cruise directors was Geraldine Saunders, who wrote of her exploits in her book The Love Boats, which inspired the hit TV series. This little ship certainly had an interesting career. And speaking of love boats, the Island Princess, of course, was the twin sister of the Pacific Princess and often featured on the show, although the name credit was given to the Pacific. Her story and a top-to-bottom deck tour can be found on this channel. Both she and the Seabourn Pride looked gorgeous all lit up that evening. Alas, it was almost dark by the time I reached the Tong Hu. If she looks a bit familiar, her twin, the former 33 Orientales, became the popular Greek cruise ship City of Rhodos. Both of these Argentine sister ships were scrapped in the early 2000s. Well, that pretty much wraps up our Hong Kong adventure. Stay tuned for the next chapter, the final voyage of the SS Shanghai, which is coming soon to Midship Cinema.